Good morning. Welcome to WACO. Well, while everybody gets seated and enjoy the healthy breakfast, we have an interesting meeting today. We're going to be learning something new. And before we get started, I'd like to invite the Senior Associate with Michael Baker, Mr. Bob Carley, to lead us on the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of our country. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Bob. Well, we started with some bad news and then good news. The bad news is our Vice Chair, Ethan Temianka, who was a director for Mesa Water, has moved out of the States, and that's the bad news. Because of that, and he was also our Vice Chair, so we have asked Jim Atkinson, also a director for Mesa, to fill in for the rest of the term that Ethan had. So that is the good news, that we have now Jim as the Vice President or Vice Chair of WACO. So, Jim, if you stand up so we can recognize you. Señor. Okay, Director has been second, and then everybody who is in favor say yes. Yes. Those who say oppose say nay. Unanimously confirmed. Thank you. Thank you, Pierre. We have now the report by Aqua, by Dorothy. Oh, Kathy Green, sorry. I missed the green names.
Good morning, everybody. Aqua region elections for 2018-19 for the region boards, including chair and vice chair, are happening now. And ballots are due by September 29th. So every agency gets one vote who's a member of Aqua. So please get your ballots in. Election ballots were sent out to all member agencies, general managers, and presidents. There's one vote, one vote per member agency. Ballots are also available on our Aqua website. Also, if you would like to serve on an Aqua committee, ask the general manager of your agency to identify you and sign an online form to be submitted by September 29th. There are a lot of committees, and they're really interesting. On October 6th, Region 9 and 10 are jointly hosting an event in Corona that will include a tour of Prado Wetlands and the Prado Dam. After the tour, there will be two panel discussions above and below the dam operations. Registration will open up in probably a couple of weeks on aqua.com, and would be pleased for all of you to come. It's very interesting. It really is. Aqua recently released a water infrastructure briefing paper with policies aimed at improving California's water supply. It's entitled 21st Century Water Infrastructure, New Approaches to Create Flexibility and Resiliency, which is now available on the Aqua website. This briefing paper outlines new approaches modeled in a recent technical study and discusses how investments in the 21st century water infrastructure could provide tools to bring much needed resiliency to our system. WACO also sent out an alert, I hope you all received it, on SB 623, Senator Manning's bill, asking for members to join in a coalition letter to oppose unless amended. The bill, as it is looking like a vehicle for a new tax on water. SB 623 is aimed at funding drinking water solutions for disadvantaged communities. While ACWA agrees with the intent of the bill, the association has taken an oppose unless amended position due to the concerns about the funding categories and possible funding mechanisms such as a new water tax. All of us should be looking at this. Please contact Brandon Ida at ACWA to add your agency to the coalition letter if you have not already done so. Finally, the ACWA Fall Conference will be in Anaheim this November 28th through December 1st, and registration is now open. So I hope you'll all come. Thank you.
Well, our favorite director, Linda Ackerman, is not here today, so we invited our second favorite director, Mr. Larry Dick, to give us the state of the Metropolitan Water District.
No, but at least Larry McKinney wasn't here to hear that, was he? Oh, yes, he was. Boy, you're not going to be on his Christmas card list. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's a disappointment to see me here instead of Linda, but buck up. We have some interesting times at the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. You've heard, of course, that we've gone through some years of drought. That may not be news to you. We've also gotten some water in recent months. Thank you, Mother Nature. Many of you probably know, but for those of you who have missed it, the maximum amount of water that the Metropolitan Water District has ever managed to put into storage in 1 year is 700,000 acre feet. That's almost the size of Diamond Valley Lake. This year, with the cooperation of a lot of willing hearts and minds, a lot of them, we should put in over 1 million acre feet. It'll be a record for Metropolitan. You should all sleep better in your beds at night, knowing that hardworking engineers and others are out there trying to develop a way to maximize storage. One of the ways that's been done this year has been by cyclic accounts. What's that mean to y'all? In this case, it means a lot to us because not every agency is going to be ready and able to take advantage of this. By operating in an in-lieu program where treated water is delivered to retail agencies instead of pumping it from the ground, we are able to keep precious water in our underground storage. We've worked closely with a number of agencies, specifically in our case, the Orange County Water District, and they have been open-hearted and open-minded in trying to find a solution that will work for all. Their staff has worked, their directors have worked, as have we. There will be a credit given to certain accounts, those who have engaged in this in-lieu storage program, that will offset the costs of the treated water. They won't have to pay for the balance of the water in the ground for a period of time that is negotiated. I think it's 3 years. I'm looking at Phil, and I think that's right. So you won't have to pay for that until you actually use it. But the important thing is that water will not run to the sea. It will be able to be tucked away for us in future years. I think that's very important for you to remember. I know that you work there and you understand that. That's important. But we also stand on the very edge of an exciting new day, and that is regarding the California fix. Now, there are those who have been more enthusiastic about the California fix than others. But allow me to assure you, for those of you who have any reservations, that every local supply has as a base, a benchmark, whatever term you want to use, a certain amount of Delta water involved in the base load of every agency. I would share with you some of the remarks that were made at our most recent board meeting at Metropolitan, at committee meeting actually, excuse me. One of them was, Goldman Sachs will be profiting from widows and orphans. Now, I may be paraphrasing that a little bit. But they're saying Goldman Sachs has come in with the ideas of a 75-year intergenerational loan to finance the water fix. And they were distressed about that, and I can understand why. 75-year mortgages are, At the same time, at current interest rates, who knows? And if it's an intergenerational debt, it's also an intergenerational value. I don't believe we will embrace that as our method of financing. But that was one of the arguments. Allow me to point out that for those of us that are here, the anticipated rate increase could be as much as $4 or $5 a month. On the other hand, when you look at the debt that is aging out on the Diamond Valley Lake, that could be as much as $4 or $5 a month. And when you look at the fact that we don't have the courage to walk away from this water because there's no place to get as much water as reliably. And I would point out to you what I consider the most important dimension of this, or one of the most important dimensions, is not how much water we get in a wet year, but what the reliability is for a supply of water in a dry year. Twice as much as without. Twice as much. Write that on your shirt tail. Twice as much as in a dry year. And let me tell you, I promise you we will have dry years again. There were other comments made by people who obviously get their information in the same places my mother-in-law used to get hers. There's going to be a $200 or a $400 a month rate increase. Ladies and gentlemen, you have my personal word, that's malarkey. We have other ideas, and I know I only have a little bit of time, so I won't talk about some of the other things they talk about, but you want to fix this so the farmers can export our water. Every time you grow a crop and you put it in a can and it goes to Iowa, you have exported California water. That's true. And we've also imported Iowa dollars. And if we don't have water, our economy goes right down the tubes. But with this project, we're going to put in new jobs for agriculture, new sustainable jobs for agriculture. We're going to put in new jobs for the trades as they build this magnificent project. And I can't help but ask, every time there are two or more of us that gather in the name of water, let's all work toward the benefit of the California fix. Linda will be back next month. You'll get a far more exciting report because she does a better job of going into the areas that I always overlook. Thank you.
Well, you heard it. Metropolitan used to store 700,000 acre feet of water. Now this year it's going to be over 1 million. And the hydrology that used to be used by Metropolitan to calculate the water was 3 years of rain, 7 years of drought. But that is changing, and we're going to be seeing more days or more years of drought, so we need the storage. We have some storage in Southern California. Northern California is not that lucky. However, what would you think if somebody comes and tell you there is a chance that we have in southern Orange County a large basin that can be used to store water? Immediately, we say, yes, I'd like to hear that. And that's the reason we invited our speaker today. These rocks you see on that stand are not to be thrown to anybody, just to show that it's a real thing. It's a real basin, and we have invited our speaker today, Rowe, to talk about that basin, that he's one of the few people who knows because of his background in geology. He hasn't been able to study it, but he's going to tell us what's the potential. And we, as interested person in the water, we need to know, is there really a potential to do that? What do we need to do to be sure? So Kelly is going to give us some ideas. To give you an idea, I don't think Kelly needs introduction. You've seen him here many times, and for 25 years he's been around. He is former director of the Orange County Water District. He's also a graduate geologist from Calif, San Diego. He has worked in many projects with FEMA as a consultant during the last 10 years. He has been founder of some of the professional organizations for geologists, and he's really a well-recognized geologist. And that's the reason he got our ears at WACO. Somebody that has a professional seriousness, and he knows his subject. So I'd like to invite Kelly and to tell us about the CESP formation or the CESP basin.
Thank you, Jose, and I'd like to thank the Planning Committee for WACO to allow me to make this presentation. It's something I've had in my mind for a few years. Came back from a FEMA assignment a little over 3.5 years ago, and I saw Richard Gardner. I thought he'd be here. You know, Richard, he always has some interesting questions and ideas. I've known him for a long time. He would attend a lot of my water resources meetings that I'd have in Southern California. And he said, you know, there's a San Juan Basin Authority has a groundwater facilities management plan that they're interested in doing some things to improve the water resource in San Juan Basin. And I said, okay, sure. Well, there isn't any groundwater in Southern California or in South Orange County. Everybody knows that. That's the idea that we've had for decades since I've been around here. But I did look at the plan that they had, and I looked, that's some good ideas, some bad ideas, and let's see how it goes. I provide some advice. And I read a section about the geology, and I saw a point of the CESP formation. I go, the CESP formation, I know that. Everybody knows their first job. Back at San Diego State when I was a student, in the hallways, Professor Pat Abbott, a sedimentologist there, said, hey, Kelly, I want you to come and help prepare some samples of rocks from this one formation. He's trying to do a regional geologic study to prove the amount of movement across the San Andreas Fault. The CESP formation was deposited between 40 and 20 million years ago, and they think the source rocks were from Sonora, Mexico. And in San Diego, there's a Poway Formation, which is similar to the CESP Formation here, where it has these large cobbles in it. And I said, sure, Dr. Pat, I'll help you out. Actually, I said Dr. Abbott. He proceeded to give me these big rocks from Sonora, Mexico, which were about that big, and which are called Papa rocks, and then from Poway Formation in San Diego, which were Mama rocks, and here's Mama rocks, smaller like you see here. Those are rocks from Jabico Canyon Road right across from the county fire station. And this is a picture in the background here showing a section which has the most cobbles that were found, a conglomerate section, which is pretty impressive, about a 200-foot thick section of all these cobbles. And I was always impressed by these rocks because they're so well-rounded and hard. I tell you, the reason why they picked me is not because of my smarts, but because I was a big guy, I had big arms, and I could use a sledgehammer to break these things up. And that what we were doing was doing geochemical fingerprinting, just getting unweathered sections of the rock and doing chemical analysis and then isotopic age dating. So we know that these rocks came at a time from when it was called rhyolite rocks. It blew up as a magma onto the surface and just was sitting there for a long time. And then rivers came from when we had a subduction zone, and they came from like 200 miles away from Mexico across California and dumped into the ocean here. So let me proceed with talking about this. Well, so my background was this first job, CESP, and I saw the report and I said, well, I think the CESP has great potential because it has all these cobbles and sands and clays, and most people think the bedrock in South Orange County was clays and silts, which of course it is. But this is the only part of a formation in South Orange County that is non-marine sediments. It's more, didn't get washed into the ocean, it had a lot of salts and clams and worms and organic matter. It's pretty clean. The basis of this presentation is on these two documents, which I have here. This is the bulletin from DWR from 1972 for the San Juan Basin. This was one of the last reports that the Department of Water Resources did on basin studies in California. And I think at that time they were kind of low on funds. They did what they could in determining what the groundwater was like, but they saw around it's just the cattle ranch area. There's only groundwater that's in the bottom of the valleys that they knew of because they only had cattle ranch wells for like 20,000 people. There's San Juan Capistrano, and the Mission Viejo was starting back in the late 60s when they did this study. So they had limited information. They drilled one well in San Diego, which I'll talk about, and it didn't prove out to be too good. And people had thought, well, that's just the result. The bedrock is pretty lousy for water quality. Actually, water quality is not too bad, but the production is pretty poor. And then a year and a half ago, I completed this compilation of more recent research done since 1972 that I found about the geology and hydrogeology, and I compiled it into this report, which it's like 200 megabyte files. This is volume 1. Volume 2 is which I have a lot of the basic research from the California Geological Survey, which they did detailed mapping, and I'll show some highlights from that. This is an animation from University of California, Santa Barbara Geological Department. Tanya Atwater, she was a world-renowned geophysicist who came up with the idea about seafloor spreading back in the late 60s. I met her. She's a great gal. And she came up with a lot of these animations, which coincidentally is focused on Southern California because it's so interesting. This animation starts from around 40 million years ago. It was before you see the Farallon plate, oceanic plate, was subducting underneath California, and then we'd be eroding sediments and dumping it into the ocean, and Farallon plate would subduct underneath it, carry the old sediments with the oceanic plate, and it'd form new magma, and we'd have these mountains here that were like 15 and 20,000 feet above sea level. Right now you see there's nothing here, but we before 20 million years ago, had mountains here 15 to 20,000 feet above sea level, like Alaska. Can you imagine this being considered, whoa, that's Southern California? Now we have these nice coastal communities. So it goes through, the Sesame Formation is eroding from around here across California and dumping in the ocean. Then the San Andreas Fault comes here. And it really formally develops around 5 million years ago, where you see the breakaway of the Baja California moving north. And look at next. Here's another slide which is more focused on the rocks were formed in the Jurassic time 150 million years ago, and then it jumps to the Eocene. It's kind of a jumpy mouse. So here we are, subduction zone, the Farallon plate's going underneath it, the volcanoes are blowing out, the rhyolite rocks sitting over here. And then here I'll just take a break here. So here's the Sesame in the Eocene time, which is 40 million years ago, and it's just dumping all these rocks here. Actually, this is part of San Diego, and there are rivers that are coming all across here. So you see the Sesame was down here in Sonora, Mexico, the source rocks. Here's the Poway Formation. Here's the Sesame Formation where we are. And see this, go back. See how the rocks are dumped out to the ocean. Actually, the Sesame had so much volume of sediment, it was mainly non-marine. So this, there's a little bit that probably got into the ocean, but not much really. And what's kind of wild here is that there's a little microplate that here Santa Barbara used to be down near San Diego. And I tell you that the rocks that I found that Dr. Pat brought up here were about baby size. And I said, can you get any bigger rocks? He says, no, because these rocks traveled 200 miles across the coast and then moved up 186 miles up here because the San Andreas Fault moved. So that's kind of like the background on the history of the Sesame, which I think is important for us to understand as to what the Sesame is about. Because people know the Sesame in Santa Barbara and Ventura County as more of a fine-grained sediment and doesn't yield too much water. But here we're at the start of the deposits on the edge of the mountains, which had a higher energy depositional environment, had higher rocks, higher sand content than over there in Santa Barbara, Ventura. Here I did a Google Maps or Google Earth profile across the Peru coastal area, and it kind of shows that for 100 miles you still have at least 10,000 feet elevation. And the Sespe, I say, came about 200 miles away. So we had these big rivers, and the Sespe, or the Eocene and the Oligocene from 40 to 20 million years ago was a really dry climate. So you had probably less than 12 inches of rainfall than here, and so you'd have these flash floods that would bring these big rocks from a couple hundred miles away across the mountains and then down these high slopes. Down here is a current profile from Newport Coast, where Santiago Peak. I occasionally ask people, how high do you think the Santiago Peak is, or Saddleback Mountain? And most people say, oh, it's like 4,000 feet. Well, actually, it's closer to 6,000 feet. And then the Mount San Jacinto is here about 11,000 feet, within about 80 miles of the coast. And then the San Andreas Fault in the Coachella Valley, it's closer to sea level down there in the Salton Sea, which is like the delta of the Colorado River. So we have the San Andreas Fault over here by Mount San Jacinto. We have the Elsinore Fault, which is associated with the San Andreas, which is moving. We're moving to the north a little faster than that to the east. And then there's the Newport Inglewood Fault off the coast here, which we're moving further north than the Pacific Plate further out. And I thought I'd bring up, for this zone here, closer to the coast, it's like a 15,000-foot difference across a course of 25 miles, or 600 feet per mile. Can you imagine if we had a slope here of 600 feet per mile? It's like, the Empire State Building within about a mile here. It's a pretty good hike. Right now, our slope in the coastal plain is like 5 feet per mile. Bring up here's some quick information about the Sespe you can read. It shows that the lower Santiago and upper Santiago, which is deposited when it's a little more humid, more rain, has more organic matter, is closer to the coast, deposited in the marine environment. And then the upper Santiago has evidence that it's also similar to Sespe as being a non-marine deposit, and that's where some wells have been used tapping the upper Santiago, but not that many. Most of them tap the lower Santiago along the San Juan Basin, along San Juan Creek. And I mentioned here the Sespe. There's a Poway Formation, the Sespe, and there's also another river that they identified in Mexico. Several rivers that dump these massive amounts of sediments with these big rocks from these big rivers into the coast. I mentioned the Picaros Formation, which was deposited in the Oligocene maybe 15 or 30 to 15 million years ago, and it has more marine deposits, and that's found more near Lake Forest, on top of as a wedge on top of the Sespe. The Miocene is when it was really crazy around here for geology. We had the Pacific Plate was moving us north, and it's stretching out the geology here. We had a thinner crust, the magma was going here, we had volcanism, we had a lot of ash in the air, and that's the reason why we have a lot of petroleum and gas in the Miocene deposits, because the microscopic organisms, diatoms, grew like crazy with all the ash in the air. Their shells are silica, and they went crazy, having lots of kids with all the ash in the air, and a lot of nearby sediments. So that's where you see most of the bedrock in southern Orange County is these tight clays and silts and sands, and not very good for construction. The diatoms are very light and doesn't make the soil very stable. And the Christina's Fault is something that people know about in South Orange County. It's a major fault that goes north-south. Most of our faults in California go in the same alignment as the San Andreas Fault, but the Christina's Fault was formed basically before the San Andreas, when we were being pulled apart, and the part here on the left was dropped down more than the part in the middle. I call the Sespe or middle block, and then it's more like the Santa Ana Mountains to the east, which didn't drop down as further. And this is what happened right around the 5 or so million years ago, when the San Andreas Fault really got started here, moving us forward. We were kind of set with the Capistrano Formation, where we had a lot of tectonics going on. We had like an island to the southwest of Dana Point, which is dumping a bunch of sediments. That since has been eroded away and gone, but the Capistrano Formation and other rocks from 5 million years ago and sooner is evidence of that. And we were also kind of dropped down to the ocean, and we were kind of covered with the Sespe in this area had probably maybe 2,000 or 3,000 feet of younger sediments dropped on top of it. In the last 4 million years, though, we've been uplifted at a rate of about 1,000 feet per million years, or about 0.3 millimeters per year, which doesn't seem like much now, but after a billion years, that's 1,000 feet. And they based that on looking at the beach terrace deposits that they found some beach terraces all along the slopes, and they did some geochemical dating and said it's a rate of about 1/3 of a millimeter per year. So we've been rising this whole block, not just the Santa Ana Mountains, but from the coast between the Newport Englewood and the Elsinore. We've been rising at about 1,000 feet per million years for the last few million years. So maybe 2 million years ago we were below sea level around here. Now we've been above sea level for at least 1 million years. And this is a more current, I'd say, cartoon of what I think the geology like is. There's a Google Earth profile showing how the elevation around Rancho Santa Margarita is around 1,000 feet above sea level. And there's their good old San Diego Peak, which is close to 6,000 feet. And just to the east of that is the Elsinore Fault, which is still kind of making us kind of rise up the way to... Okay. Let's talk about the groundwater basins just to give a perspective. There's La Habra Basin to the north, which is an alluvial basin. They just have natural recharge in a few wells that La Brea and or La Habra and Brea use, and it's connected with the groundwater flow into LA County. The Orange County Coastal Basin, everybody's familiar with. It's got 350 square miles, and the DVR says the annual safe yield is about 200,000 acre-feet per year based upon the amount of groundwater recharge that occurs off the Santa Ana River and whatever incidental recharge occurs along the Loma Ridge and the Santa Ana Mountains. The outline there shows the shallow aquifers, but the people have been talking about getting groundwater from the main Orange County Basin for South Orange County. I tell you, if you want to put in some wells, you have to put them in up here because this is where the deep aquifer is. And you got Mesa and IWD and Fountain Valley all pumping here, getting pressure on the coastal groundwater flow, potential for seawater intrusion. You have to have wells up here, which is about 15 miles away from Lake Forest. You have to get it uphill to about 1,000 feet elevation to get it up into the San Juan Basin. 15 miles is a long way to do. It costs a lot of money, put in a lot of wells, pretty expensive. So everybody knows the San Juan Creek doesn't have any groundwater. They only looked at the valley-filled alluvial aquifers, the bottom of the valleys, and DBR estimated about 90,000 acre-feet per year, and the annual safe yield is about 10,000 acre-feet per year, which isn't that much. It's not worth considering as being that important of a basin. It has a low priority according to the DBR and potential funding from state bonds that we have available. So it's not adjudicated. People think it's adjudicated, but it's actually being permitted by the State Water Resource Control Board because people see that the groundwater is flowing through known and defined channels. And the focus on production here has been the San Juan Capistrano area. San Juan Capistrano has wells along the San Juan Creek here, and here's where the TDS, or total dissolved solids, gets poured like 2,000 milligrams per liter and higher. And then there's a South Coast water production well with a desal plant here, and then the San Juan Capistrano. Oh, where's the mouse? Has some wells a little further upstream that they've been producing. Last year when we had a drought, they had to shut off those wells because there was a permit requirement that you don't want to impact the biology in the San Juan Creek. The biologists monitor on behalf of the San Juan Basin Authority, and they said, hey, it's pretty stressed. Water levels are low. You don't want to have seawater intrusion as being an issue. And I thought I'd mention here, I did have an idea. right here across Doheny State Beach. I'm a seawater intrusion barrier expert. I've worked here on the wells for the Orange County Water District on Ellis Avenue. And this seems like an ideal place. You could put in a physical barrier about 3,000 feet long across the northern edge of the Doheny State Beach and dig down with basically a clamshell, 1.5 foot wide strip down to like 150 feet maximum, but savage depth about 100 feet, and be able to prevent 500 acre feet of groundwater flow out into the ocean, and it would prevent seawater intrusion from coming into the basin at a cost of about $10 million, which it's not on anybody's radar, but since I'm here, I thought I'd bring it up. It'd be a good deal to pay for itself within about 10 years or so. Prevent seawater intrusion, and you could be able to not worry about pumping out the groundwater basin that badly. The red water district names here are those that are currently affiliated with the San Juan Basin Authority. There were more members in the past. The Trabuco Canyon Water District up here in the north, they have a couple of wells in Trabuco Creek, which when it was dry last year, they had to shut off. But now we have water. They say, hey, let's use that water because it's pretty darn cheap. The Calif National Forest is up here. There's about 10,000 acre area. Where's that darn mouse? 10,000 acres up here that when it rains, this is like the highest point in Orange County, that the water comes here and then rushes right through and goes all the way down here to San Juan out to the ocean. I also mentioned the San Juan Basin Authority has what they call the San Juan Project, which is to put in inflatable dams across the existing channel within about a 20-30 acre area to be able to improve the amount of water recharge in the San Juan Basin right in this area, which what has been their focus. The San Juan Basin Authority just focuses on the groundwater in this area. They have ignored everything else pretty much, but what's been going on with the San Juan Capistrano and South Orange County Water District's interest in maintaining the water levels. Molten Miguel has basically part of its territory on the western edge of the San Juan Basin. They don't have any wells, and Santa Margarita Water District doesn't have any wells either. The future development of Cala Ranch land through Rancho Mission Vejos to put in more developments, residential developments here, and they've sought to get water from Cadiz project and elsewhere to support the development. And then we have the Sespe Aquifer, which was identified in this report, 1972, by DWR to be a potentially excellent aquifer and a good aquifer. They said it both excellent and good many times in 1972, but nobody's done anything about it. They identified this extent in 1972, which I'll show in another slide or two. And what's the other? Oh, this is 1972, the extent of the wells that the DWR had for determining what the groundwater was like in San Juan Basin. See, they could only do with what they had. I said they were pretty poor. All the staff was pretty much leaving, getting jobs in the consulting where the big money was, and DWR was running out of money. So they looked at this information and the geology and said, here we go. We got the Oso Creek along the west edge. Then you have Trabuco Creek, which runs up here. Tied to it is the Cañada Chiquita, Cañada Comunidora, Bell Canyon. And I'd say that the bottom valleys are like a half a mile wide to 100 feet deep in alluvial deposits. Here's the overlay from the authority had a consultant last year look at DWR's report of well logs in their office, and they basically had 230 wells that they identified. A lot of them are groundwater monitoring wells for groundwater contamination. Some water production wells that were there in the records, and they simply overlay. And you see that there aren't any wells still that have looked at the Sespe. These here along Trabuco Creek, they're mainly in the valley-filled alluvium, fairly shallow. Nobody's been drilled down deep here. I went to OCWD last year and said, hey, do you have any well logs here? And they said, yeah, we got some. And they pointed out that in 1990s, Cota de Casa had a lot of domestic wells, which were drilled not exactly in the Sespe, but right in the upper Santiago, They were 5-inch diameter domestic wells. The well log said that you could pump about, these are like 300 feet deep on average. You could pump 40 to 100 gallons per minute out of these, shallow wells with a limited diameter for a type of pump you can pump water out of. In 1972, DER reported that there was seepage areas along the Tejedas Canyon right near where the Trabuco Creek is, which to me says it's seepage coming from the Sespe Aquifer, and for also along the Gubernador area, which Santa Margarita Water District says that this is urban runoff that's occurring, but it's been seepage there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You look at old topographic maps for this area, it shows that there are ponds there from what I call seepage of Sespe Aquifer water. Groundwater flows from Trabuco Creek, that's the main recharge, and then goes through here. This is like 900 to about 700 feet elevation here along Trabuco Creek, and then it flows down here to where this is the elevation of around 400 feet down to San Juan Creek, which is about 100 feet here. Here's the 1972 geology map that DER had, and like I said, they had 90,000 acre feet of storage in the gray areas, and it covers just a little under 17,000 acres in area. As I said, there was only 20,000 people there in 1970, and I'd say there's closer to 500,000 people. I'm corrected, it's actually less. It's 500,000 people is all of South Orange County, and it's going to be growing. That's the only growth area that we really have in Orange County. I highlighted the section that DER had on the extent of the Sespe in blue, and then this is the Santiago Formation, which the upper Santiago is basically a band, maybe 500 feet thickness around the south and east edge of the Santiago. This is basically a wedge where it's thicker here, it's higher elevation. It's like 1,000 feet to about 800 feet here, and it goes down to about 600 feet here, 400 feet here. You see, there's not much recharge that occurs along the Harris Canyon at fairly low elevation. In these watersheds, most of the recharge occurs along Trabuco Creek from the flow through to Trabuco Creek from the Cleveland National Forest area. And based upon this, in my report, I said, we got about 12,000 acres, which it's only 5,000 acres smaller than the alluvial aquifers. And if you want to put that in perspective, does anybody know how big of an area Diamond Valley Lake has? It's 5,000 acres an area. Just by water sitting there, they lose like 25,000 acre feet a year, a water year. It's like 5 feet of evaporation. So here you got 2 Diamond Valley lakes, and there's no evaporation that occurs. So you got I'd say like 10,000 acre area, and so 1,000 feet thick on average. It's thin on east and southeast, and thick on the northwest. And like 20% specific yield, or the amount of water that will drain from the Sespe, which is based upon evidence that from lab testing as being kind of a conservative number. And that's about 2 million acre feet of water there. I'll go over what the water quality data is too, just so you can get a sense of that. Yes? Just a few feet. Most of this has been washed away over the last few million years when we've been exposed to above water. And so you have in the Rancho Santa Margarita area, it's maybe 10 feet or so to the Sespe, and the alluvial aquifers here, these are probably maybe 50 to 100 feet thick. It's easy drilling, kind of loose materials. The Sespe, well, the slope here, as I'll say later, it's like 100 feet per mile from here. It's like 1,000 feet to 800 feet, and it's like a 2-mile width. So it's 2 to 3 miles wide and about 6 miles long. This is El Toro Road up here, and then there's Oso Parkway is down here. And they plan on getting 241 basically comes all the way through the middle of this thing, and it stops at Oso, as people know who drive out there. The research I did showed there was Doug Morton, who I've known for many years, who worked for the California Geological Survey. In 1970, he came up with a report which showed these geologic profiles, which I'll show. And there's the Santiago Formation underlies this area as like a wedge. And then in 1986, he came up with a report looking at the geology in this area, and he has a couple profiles, which I'll show. And the Vaqueros Formation is on top of here. It gets thicker to the northwest, but the Sespe, I think, is underneath here, which I think is exploitable. I forgot to say something about the Orange County Water District has 1,000 acres of recharge area and 26,000 acre feet that they can store for recharge facilities. The San Juan Basin has 0 recharge. They're trying to do something like 20, 30 acres down near San Juan Capistrano. There's 200 production wells in Orange County, 400 groundwater monitoring wells. San Juan Basin has maybe about 100 production wells with, only a few of them are municipal production wells. Most of them are domestic or for private owners, golf course. This is a profile from 1986 showing us this is that outcrop along the Trabuco Canyon Road across from the county fire station. And it's a pretty massive part. But you got sand and gravels in little lenses and layers through here. This is a 1-to-1 scale where vertical is, it's basically this is 2,000 feet, this is 2,000 feet about. So it shows it's at least 1,000 feet, maybe 1,500 feet thick here as far as you're going. No oil wells have been drilled here. I mentioned the Miocene Formation from 20 to 6 million years ago is where all the oil is. They said, the Sespe, it's Oligocene, it's older than 20 million years. There's no oil there. We're not going to drill it. Why waste our time? So it's based upon just looking at the surface exposures of rocks here and whatever limited drilling that has been done through domestic wells that you could make a determination about what the geology is like. So the crystallinous fault is here on the left. Here's actually the Vaqueros Formation is like a wedge of maybe 800 feet thick here on the further west, and it thins over here on the east. This is the further south wells, or cross sections, and it shows a thinner section of the Sespe and maybe a little thicker upper Santiago that he could determine. The Vaqueros is thicker over here in a wedge. To kind of change the perspective, I changed the scale from 10 to 1, 1 vertical, or 10 vertical to 1 horizontal, or the other way around. Anyway, this kind of exaggerates the vertical sense in that there's here once again is a Google Earth profile of what the elevation change is. It goes from here about 750 feet above sea level, and down near San Juan Creek, it's about 250 feet elevation. Here's where you got the seepage from the along Gobernador Creek, and there's probably some seepage that's been occurring in the past along the lower points here where the groundwater has been flowing from the Sespe to the surface. When times are dry here, I think the Trabuco Creek alluvial aquifer here, which is maybe like 600 feet wide by about 100 feet deep, it gets some groundwater recharge from the Sespe, and when it's wet, the Trabuco Creek recharges the Sespe here in a limited amount of way. I thought I'd mention here that also because of the amount of time that we've been above sea level, there's probably been 1 million years of groundwater flowing from the Trabuco Creek seep into the Sespe, and the water quality is probably overall good, except maybe some zones here they haven't had much circulation, so it may be a little saltier down here, but it's still looking good, like less than 500 TDS water. And the groundwater flow, because it kind of hits the crystallinous fault, it kind of is heading south. And there's the upper Santiago to the south. And these are like southwest northeast profiles. This is right along the creek where it shows it's like 800 feet to 1,000 feet elevation. 241 kind of goes right through here. Oops, I back up here. How do you back up? So it's 100 feet per mile slope. It's still fairly high energy. Recharge basins here would be a challenge. You'd have to have them more frequent to allow capture of stormwater runoff, and maybe get net water to recharge the Sespe. And I think if you do like GWS in South Orange County, you can take purified wastewater instead of using for landscape irrigation, put it up here for storage in the Sespe for times of drought when we can use it. And then down there, Oso Parkway, there's like the Coto de Casa where the seepage occurs. The groundwater elevation here in dashed blue is kind of what we're looking at. All right, now we're getting into the macroscopic, looking at the lab tests were done by DVR on a couple samples near, maybe about a mile north of Oso Parkway for the Sespe. They analyzed and found that the permeability here, these are kind of odd concepts for a lot of people. Minder units is a classic way of describing what the coefficient of permeability is, the hydraulic conductivity, and that's not so bad. Charting that on a classic chart showing. Right. And that's where they pay me the big bucks as a hydrogeologist, try to know what the. Okay, well, if you have clays and silts, there's not much water for it to go through. There's a lot of. 30 is. Well, this is 30, where you got considered a good aquifer. This is where it plots. It's clean sands and gravel, which is what Sespe is. And then the sandstone, which has been sitting there, it's maybe all sand, but it's compacted and cemented. It's like 10 times lower in amount of water that can go, or even four times lower. So I'd say 10,000 times worse. The amount of water that would go through there is probably like 1 foot per day, while the amount of water that would go through the Sespe would be maybe like 3 feet per day. While alluvium would be about 5 feet per day or higher, like in the valley fill alluvium, probably more than 5 feet per day at the normal gradients that you have. Groundwater flows downhill, and it kind of flows because of the resistance of the soil to water flowing through it. I don't know if that helps, but something to consider. That this chart shows the results show that it's not so bad, not as good as I'd like. Hydrogeologists like to see these minder units or permeability values be much higher. Well, actually, I think I could say clays would be, instead of like 2 or 1, it would be like 1/millionth that flow. Yes. I don't know what you mean by that. Well, mean where they recharge the percolation basins there? Well, percolation, Orange County Water District made many presentations on this. You have GWS water and the flow of water into the basin. It's probably closer to, permeability is probably closer to like 10 or 20. We got 1 and 2 here. The amount of I'd say sinking of water into the percolation basins with GWS water, which is clean, nothing in it, it's like 10 feet per day, and it kind of stays that way consistently. When we clean the basins, the amount of flow into the soils in the basin is maybe 5 or 6 feet per day, but then it goes to like 3, which is kind of like what you expect, and then once it gets down to like 1 or a half foot per day, they say, hey, we got to clean the basins because there's microorganisms that form at the surface of the soil-water interface, and it's not a good thing. We need to. Okay. Yeah, it's a logarithmic scale, yeah. Yeah, it's not so good. You talked logarithmic. If it had the actual unit, arithmetic scale, we'd be way out the door. Yeah. The DWR porosity results were 20.4 and 25, which, if ideally, we'd be closer to like 35 here. When actually it's down here close to this range, which means that the Sespe's been compacted a little bit. I can go up there and kick the side of the Sespe, and it'll kind of come loose. It's not like you kick it and you go, I'll hurt my foot. You basically can loosen up the soil. It's not compacted, which is most people expect it being pretty hard and compacted and not very permeable or porous. Well, I think this shows the Sespe's not so bad. And these are, I'd say, I've done thousands of these sieve analysis. You take a soil sample, you kind of loosen it up, you run it through different size sieves, and it gives you a sense of what the distribution, what the size of the different sediments are in the sample. The more sand and gravel you have, the more porous and permeable it may be, or more, at least more permeable it would be. And the CESP shows that it's being a coarse sand and hardly any silt and clay, which is a good thing. It's another evidence that it has great potential. Here I identified the CESP areas in my mind that I've done maybe 50 basin studies, and I said, well, we ideally want to have a recharge area and a production area. You don't want to have your production wells in the middle of a recharge area just because you have potential for contamination in the recharge area and be drawing in contamination at your production. If you have contamination, you say, wait a minute, we want to make sure we don't start pumping that. But so here we have like a fresh start for, let's say call this a basin, but I call this like an unusual geological setting. A block or wedge of these permeable porous sediments are sitting there at 1,000 feet elevation and higher and lower, about 10 miles from the coast. It's something we can manage if we have the facilities properly. So here we got the Trabuco Creek runs through here, and that's the key part of operating this. Right now, if you just put in production wells, you'd be mining out the water. You need to look at this long term and put in groundwater recharge basins to sink whatever water that you put in, you can pump out. And I identify these areas like 1, 2, 3, and 4 for discussion purposes, and this would probably be like the ideal area to do some groundwater production wells, and it'd be good if we put monitoring wells here along Trabuco Creek. Orange County Parks, I think we have the good potential to use some land there for nothing. Get permits from the supervisors to put in exploratory wells. And I put these white dots are places I went to Google Earth and looked and said, oh, here's a park, here's next to a water tank. This is probably a good place. There's enough room to put in a drill rig to put in a production well or a monitoring well. So those are like predetermined, at least by Kelly determined locations for putting in wells based on a overview look. If you look at if we really want to develop this, then go in and make sure we have good sites. I've done hundreds of well siting studies. Here's what I put in the report. That I thought we need to have something near Trabuco Canyon Rowe, which crosses here is basically a couple of pipes across Trabuco Creek that are maybe like 3-foot diameter and with a concrete bridge, not necessarily bridge, but a pad across it. And I really need to do better here because there's a lot of traffic that goes through here to Trabuco Canyon Road. And then this is the start of the CESP. Need to start putting in some percolation basins here to be able to, I'd say, do ecosystem enhancement, which is important for people to accept this as a project. Primarily issue, let's look at the ecosystem maintenance. Second would be water conservation rather than let it go out to the ocean. And third is I think we can get some grant funding is to look at FEMA's hazard mitigation to prevent flood damage downstream. Right now, we do have a lot of flood damage from Trabuco, and this is, I think, a good mitigation to help our overall objectives. This is the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, which the green here is the 1% chance flood inundation area. That's officially what it is. Most people just simply call it the 100-year flood. And this shows how it is through Trabuco Canyon Road downstream for several miles. There's like 200 acres, I figure, that are here. I broke that down into further sub-areas, which is I call the primary here from Trabuco Canyon Road down to 241. There's like 50 acres. Here's about 40 acres, and then more than 50 acres further downstream. And topographically, this is how the Trabuco Creek goes. It's mainly on the south side of the floodplain. And I thought I'd dream up something here. What if we have percolation basins? We have 27 percolation basins here. We're going at about 100 feet per mile, so we're going to have a lot of cascading basins to, let's say, reduce ecosystem enhancement, recharge conservation, flood damage reduction. And this project, it basically negates the use of the San Juan project, the inflatable dams that they want to spend like $10, $12 million on to capture maybe 1,000 acre feet or so. in the San Juan Capistrano area. This would probably capture a lot of that water. So it'd be kind of a waste of effort to put in the inflatable dams. I proposed this as an alternative project to consider for the San Juan Project Environmental Impact Report, which is due this month, but I don't know if it's being considered. This is from my report. It's a quick profile across the Trabuco Canyon. 241 goes across here, and you go, oh, there's the Trabuco Canyon. There's lots of trees, and nice O'Neill Park. Hardly anybody goes down there, and it is a difference of a little over 100 feet. Canyon there, which is pretty neat. The Sespe is pretty close here, within about 10 or so, 20 feet of the surface. Just ideally, if you had the Rancho Santa Margarita Lake, if you stripped out the seal below the lake, you have a groundwater recharge here, get into the Sespe, which would then be, go further downstream. And here, where the recharge is only along the creek, but if we have berms that can, store some of the water over here to the side, we have more surface area to sink more water. There's limited water quality data that we have. DDRS report had what they call Upper Trabuco Division, which basically covered the Sespe aquifer area going down to San Juan Creek, and they said, hey, the water quality is like less than 500 milligrams per liter. It's a calcium bicarbonate type water, which is pretty fresh water, has a little more just kind of recent groundwater recharge, has been sitting with rocks to dissolve minerals in it, so less than 500 milligrams per liter, that's pretty good. But nobody's put any wells in there to tap it. I think, like I said, the groundwater recharge from the Sespe through the Trabuco has probably made the Sespe aquifer good overall, but we need to have more wells at different depths to see what's what. This is a table, going pretty good on time, table showing what the TDS is. It kind of shows limited data from 1960s to 1970. It's there's some high years, and I'm not sure where they got the data from. They're more detailed tables that are in this report, but I judge that it's pretty good overall in Sespe. Next steps for the Sespe aquifer development, which I've been mentioning for a few years here, is to have a proof exploratory well. And I talked to a developer, but they've been reluctant to do anything. They have higher priorities, and I'm still trying to hopefully get some momentum here in this presentation, and I'm willing to talk to any organization here to try to advance this Sespe aquifer development. To me, this is like a once-in-a-lifetime chance to discover this in South Orange County, which we've assumed that there's no groundwater there, but I think that there's plenty of groundwater there. And I have this data that I think any hydrogeologist can look at right now and say, yeah, Kelly's right. Or they can be skeptical and come up with some other ideas, but sure, let's look at what we can do to get our assurances that we can go ahead and spend some money in public's interest to basically have a reliable supply of groundwater that would lower our water rates and increase our property values, having a local supply of water. Two is I think we need to develop what I call a Sespe Aquifer Commission. The San Juan Basin Authority in itself doesn't appear interested in moving forward on this, and I'm kind of frustrated, but hey, I'm happy to try to move this thing forward. I see how people don't have any funds to do that, but if you have any ideas about how to fund this, I encourage those organizations to move forward and say, hey, I'd like to help advance this. I'm happy to try to help do that. I talked to the Bureau of Reclamation and gave them a copy of my report, and they're considering it, but they don't necessarily have programs that would fit this sort of project, doing exploratory drilling and testing to see what the groundwater potential is. And so then the organization or commission, I think, would be good to try to say, okay, what do we do from here? Right now, there's little organization for doing any groundwater recharge, like I'm talking about, or putting in production wells. How do other organizations use this? I call a centerpiece of groundwater or water resources management in South Orange County. This is a big storage, treatment, and distribution facilities, which is what aquifers are all about. And right now, it's an unused resource. I'd like to have San Juan Basin eventual goal is change it from a low priority basin to a medium priority basin, so we can qualify for getting fundings from the state in whatever facilities, bonds that we can get them to sell to afford to pay for things to help develop this project. It's worth a lot of money. Right now, there's no replenishment assessment for like you have in Orange County Water District. It's basically put in a well, and it's kind of a high cost, which I'll go over. But once you have the water producing, it can be paying for the water production well within a matter of a few years. And then after that time, I think then you can say, hey, well, we need a replenishment assessment to afford to do the facilities like the recharge basins. Yes?
Earlier you pointed out that seepage areas, which were discounted as being urban runoff, can't you test that water and confirm?
Sure.
So it wouldn't be complicated to test it and confirm that it isn't runoff?
Sure. Not out of my pocket. I've put in a lot of effort, brain power to try to get to this point right here. I'm bringing up these ideas and saying, well, anybody want to help? There's probably some data already there, and I'm pretty assured that it's a good thing that we're going to be able to prove that. Let me just continue the last few slides here. This is the first step, which I think would be good to identify if the CESP has anything at depth. Simple test, put exploratory boring, do geologic logging, geophysical logging. Step 2 is to put in a pipe in the ground with a screen at it, put a seal above it, clay, suck out the water to see what the water quality is like, test that. Go up to the next zone, put a seal above that, and so you can say, well, the geology says the geology is good, geophysics says geology is good or not, and then the water quality say whether it's good or not. Maybe we could put in a groundwater monitoring well at that time, maybe just say, we'll think about it later. Put in like at least one of these, 3 would be better to kind of prove it's consistent, good quality. And the costs were $300 per foot. Drillers aren't going to volunteer doing anything like this. So that would be about $300,000 to construct, or to do this drilling and testing. Put in a groundwater production well, that's a different story. It's not a cheap undertaking. It's like $2,000 per foot for putting in a reasonably sized water production well for municipal purposes, where you can pump 2,000 to 3,000 gallons per minute. Or I'm expecting maybe 1,000 gallons per minute, being kind of conservative for the fairly long permeable section. And then the cost for equipping is about $2 million per well, too, or $4 million for the whole system. Then anyone interested in exploring and developing a new cheap supply of good quality groundwater in South Orange County, just give me a call.
Okay, we have time for several questions. Raise your hand and I will be...
So what's the next step? I mean, you talk about a lot of different options and just to get the water optimally used. What's the next step?
Well, the next step is I've advocated a phased approach to doing this development of the CESP. I proposed 3 years ago. Do an initial research study, which I voluntarily did myself because there was no interest in funding it. I said I'll write it myself. Phase 1 would be doing exploratory borings and do the, let's see.
$300,000 deal.
Oops, yeah, back. Yeah, $300,000 deal. That's what I'm here to ask for. Yeah, like I've been. It's like, is there, like Santa Margarita Water District, I've approached them, they say, we don't have any money.
The question for you?
Yes.
Not so much a question, but, we've, a number of us have listened to Kelly talk about this for a long time. We said, okay, put up or shut up, and tell us about it. He spoke in terms that 90% of the people in this room don't probably understand very well. What he says is there's a potential for water storage more than water development down in South County. And no one really knows because there hasn't been a whole lot of exploration there. And his question is, if it exists, it would be of value to people. And the question is, well, how would you go about doing that, finding out? And if the people that overlie that area aren't interested in it, maybe other people would be, if there was no objection to that. So it's an interesting thing. It's more of a storage program from what I understand. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
I know it's initially you could say there's a lot of water there, and how do you get recharge? So, well, you're basically pumping it out right now, but we need to have the key groundwater recharge in the Trabuco Creek O'Neill Regional Park area, which right now is undeveloped.
But the creek itself is a very steep creek, and it takes a lot to recharge the water. It's not like the Santa Ana River that's very flat and very loose sand and gravel. So the long-term interest to people is more, can you put water in it and store it and pump it out when you need it? And it was a question, and so having been, along with other on the steering committee, tired of listening to this,
Wait a minute.
in little fragments, we said, put it all together, do a presentation. I followed about 15% of this, but it's enough to say, hey, it's an interesting kind of deal. And having just gone through, 10 years, in which 8 were critically dry years, having a water supply somewhere in the southern part of the county might be of real interest. And, if anyone is interested in proving out, it isn't outrageously expensive compared to other things that people are talking about doing down in South County or in Orange County. So that's sort of my explanation from, I think that was, maybe I'm speaking for the steering committee more or less, Jim, of what the presentation's about. It's an interesting deal. Okay?
Yesterday, the South Orange County was organized to meeting in South County. Of course, and as you referenced very quickly, the San
Juan project.
Which is actually under the direction of Don Fair.
Right. It's like 80% Santa Margarita, 20% South Coast are interested in doing that.
Why can't that be tied into that other project? I know you used to go to the water meeting.
I only went to one. I asked to be on the mailing list. They have never gotten on it. And I've encouraged the San Juan Basin Authority to take part, but they said, nah, that's Dan. Uh-huh. I'm happy to do that. I've made that invitation for the last few years, and just Dan Ferentz. Yeah. Well, if you know other organizations. Sure. Mary Eileen, if you know other organizations that might be interested in developing this, I'm happy to go and talk to them about it. I could talk all day about this. It's been driving me nuts. If it weren't for Richard Gardner, I probably wouldn't even talk or even think about this. But he brought my attention to it, and there's a little interest. I'm trying to get it to go.
We can follow up on Mary Eileen. Maybe she can help.
Sure.
Great presentation.
All right, thank you.
Fascinating. A lot of it was over my head, like probably most in the room, but a lot of it sunk in. You made a comment a little bit ago, there's a lot of water there. By your estimation, can you give a high and a low range of what you think potentially is in storage right now, regardless of developing the recharge?
There's like 2 million acre feet. That's just guesstimate. When I first even looked at it, I'd say, well, it says it covers that much area, and maybe like 1 million acre feet, which, hey, that's more than 90,000 acre feet that you're thinking is storage right now. That's 10 times. Now I'm thinking there's 20 times more groundwater stored in South Orange County than what you'd be considering for decades. And is anybody interested in developing that? The Irvine Lake is a surface water storage facility. Irvine Lake,
5,000 acre feet.
that's
Of which about 18, 19 are usable.
and based upon my calculations, if you pump out 25,000 acre feet, there'd be a drop in groundwater levels in the Chesapeake of about 10 feet.
And secondly, why is it we sold the public on this proposition one, the bonds, 7.1 billion. And there's money there. Isn't there an opportunity here? Because if it's sold to the public as a water storage, that was a big deal. Why isn't there opportunity here?
Well,
Can you answer that?
I really can't. I'm not, as an individual, I can't say, hey, state, give me a bunch of money and I want to do this.
Next question.
Wait a minute.
It has to be shovel-ready and going, and we're talking about exploratory. It's in the eye of the beholder, baby. This is not shovel-ready. This is, hey, is it there? You know, and if it's there, can you make it work? You've got to go through those two things before you can get a project. But, I mean, it's something of curiosity.
I'll help you back.
That's nice of you, John.
Yeah.
One of the things I think also people in this room probably think some of the stuff that happens in the South San Diego Water District. I mean, there's not a lot of friendship right now between them and the water districts here in this building. They're claiming that these water districts are overcharging and so forth, yada, yada. So where is this water going to go? So if we do get all the things that we believe we should get, I believe it looks reasonable to go for it. So the water's pumped up. Where is it going to go?
Well, the easiest beneficiaries to get this water would be the Santa Margarita Water District, where they're always looking for water, and also Trabuco Canyon Water District, which overlies part of the Chesapeake, so it's easy for them to claim that. But I think El Toro Water District is nearby. They might have an interest to supplement their portfolio of water resources. And Molten Niguel, I know their concept has been, we're just going to conserve water. We don't need to look at for any other things. This is an opportunity after decades of participation in the authority to have this to be included in their portfolio. It's fairly nearby to investment. Put in wells and pipeline over. They're good for a local supply of water.
You know, the proper comparison here is Diamond Valley, so I appreciate that you've referred to that several times. Diamond Valley was a great idea and something of tremendous value to us now. But you're pointing to the weakness, which is the high evaporation rate. So now by comparison, you have a growing area population-wise. You have natural capabilities here that are equivalent or maybe even greater than Diamond Valley. So I think you're pointing to something that makes so much sense. But what I've found so often at every level of government, there often is a preference for the higher expense project than the diamonds right in your own backyard sometimes. And so the idea that this might not create a huge public works or create massive amounts of public expenditure is a dampener, I think, in some of the enthusiasm here. But for those of us who are taxpayers, ratepayers, I think you're onto something.
Yeah, I've been a public elected official, worked with many water districts, and I think has great value for Orange County, that has been overlooked. And that's why I'm campaigning to get this thing moving forward.
Question?
So for the group that you just mentioned, of the direct benefit, Santa Margarita and so forth, what is their response then to this information? They must have some difficulty with it.
Well, I've only had an opportunity to make presentations within the 3-minute time interval before meetings, and I say, hey, I can talk about it any time, and I've gotten no response. It's like the board of directors basically tell what the general manager and their staff do, and this is an excellent opportunity for the board members who commonly attend here to recognize that this project is out there, available for them to use for their districts. And it's up to you to direct your general managers to, hey, let's look at this. Kelly's here to help, but I've gotten paid nothing to do this. It's just my love to do this sort of work.
I applaud you on your diligence and persistence. It's freaking amazing.
Okay, thanks. All right.
I just want to compliment you on the presentation because I probably remember 85% of my geology class at San Diego State on physical geology, and I guess also working in the oil and gas industry, having those type of properties up in Northern California. So I thought it was actually very clear and put maybe some of the minutiae got in there and caught myself with the same thing, okay, I already did it, and I was waiting for you to get to the next chapter. But overall, I see that it's a very clear opportunity here from basics, what you've done through your research and the predecessors that was done 40 years ago.
Right.
They did a lot of good work back then. You said it was very limited. If we go back and say, who was doing it, how was doing it, what sort of technology. And I always go back to your friend of mine who, using a book of mathematical formulas and slide rule, built the dam over Irvine Lake and created that whole little infrastructure. And the drainage, no computers, no laptops, no satellite, or anything. It even makes it scary.
Well, like I said, a part of the fault of the CESP not being looked at before is the Department of Water Resources. It was at the end of their heyday of water resources management. They had little money. I say that they had 2 and 2. They said, hey, the CESP could be an excellent potential, and they just left it at that. They had a couple lines in there. I think if they highlighted, hey, this is good for additional exploration, here what we should do, that's why I consider my research document a supplement to what they did. To point out, they said 2 and 2 is 0, and I'm saying here's 2 and 2 is 4. As simple as that.
It seems to me that this would be a no-brainer for the net and the local resource programs. Have you presented this to them at all?
It's a local groundwater resource. It has to get into MODOC's interest. Any of the sponsoring member agencies of MODOC, go for it. I'm happy to try to advance this further.
Catherine?
Yes, just looking at that slide, you got 4 steps. Is that 4 steps in one well?
Yeah, just in one well. That's why I pointed it out. Well, just one exploratory well is the minimum. It'd be good to have 3. My initial plans were to put in like 10 exploratory wells to cover the whole area, to be like an ideal plan. You put in 10 multi-depth monitoring wells, check to make sure that the water quality is good, potential for production is good. Put in a pilot production well, be phase 3, and then if that proves to be a good producer, hey, well, let's put in a well field to be able to get 50,000 acre-feet of water per year as like an emergency supply at least. But why can't we use this on a regular basis? It's a cheap form of water that's right here.
So you're talking 300,000 per 1,000 feet, but you're showing right there then it's close to $500,000.
No, this is like 300,000 right here for a 1,000-foot deep boring. Yeah, fully equipped well is $2,000 per foot. It's a larger diameter hole, like 30-inch diameter, down 1,000 feet. That's a really expensive equipment. I've drilled all sorts of wells, put in. That's a production well, yeah. Yeah, this is like a 12-inch diameter hole down 1,000 feet.
Well, thank you very much. Well, one thing that really won't let me sleep well tonight is he just said that 200 miles, 250 million years for the CESP to move along the coast. At that rate, how long would it take for LA to be ahead of San Francisco?
Well, we've been moving north on the Pacific Plate at 2.3 inches per year. We've about 186 miles in 5.5 million years. So another 7 million years we'll be up north.
Okay. Well, the meeting is over. Have a nice day.